panel. We typically put the panelists up here, but we, very brilliant panelists that we are, we decided to break format a little bit, and we're going to ask each panelist to come up here and stand when they make their part of the presentation.
Well, that's why I only had 2 chairs, so 2 could sit and 1 could stand.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's a good idea. Kevin and Steve, y'all want to come up here, or you want to stay wherever you are?
I'm good either way.
Yeah, why don't you come up? So our panel discussion topic tonight is our 3 pertinent ideas, which is on page 60 of the big book. And since I've just finished school and I'm research heavy, I decided to look up what pertinent means just for some of us that really may not understand it. Pertinence is an adjective which means relevant or applicable to a particular matter. In our case, it's alcoholism. As the book talks about 3 pertinent ideas, it talks about our alcoholism. The ABCs, which we'll be discussing tonight, A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God would and could and would if he were sought. We hear those every reading, but tonight we're going to discuss them a little bit. Kevin's going to take the first one, the A. I'm going to take B, and Steve will finish up. Steve did ask us to reserve the last 40 minutes for him, so Kevin and I will be pretty quick. So Kevin, if you'll start, that'd be great.
Thanks, Lincoln.
Thanks,
My name's Kevin. I'm an alcoholic. The reading that the ABCs come from is in how it works, and it comes just between the second and the third step. It's kind of when we're looking back over and we're just trying to see what the first 2 steps look like. So mine is pretty much the first step. We were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. For me, looking back, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't really know what alcoholic was. I admitted that I was one before I actually knew what one was. I kind of grew into that, and I tried to kind of search, and it took me a while to figure that out. And I struggled early on because I couldn't quite pin that label on myself. The only one I had to convince that I was alcoholic was me, and or as the book says, my innermost self. And I could admit I was one, but then when under closer evaluation, I would think that maybe you guys were a lot worse than I was. That caused me a lot of pain and discomfort, and that's what brought me back to have to face that. And by that time, I knew a little bit about what an alcoholic was. I knew that I was an ego-driven person that was full of fear and had a lot of conflicts with those that were around me. And when I discovered alcohol, it became a solution, and it kind of eased up some of those feelings that I had. It erased some of the fears, and it helped me to fit in for a little while. And the problem was that when I couldn't control it, I would continue to rub people the wrong way. I'd have conflicts. Some other things came, guilt, remorse, those kind of things. When I made a mess of things, and then didn't make any attempt to clean it up. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had, it talks about the unmanageability of my life. My business was a mess. My marriage was a mess. My family didn't really want to have too much to do with me. And this was after I'd been to Alcoholics Anonymous. I came to a place that the book says is the turning point or the jumping off place. I was spinning around trying to find which way to go, and I couldn't find any friendly direction. Every way I turned, I was struggling, and when alcohol was no longer work for me and give me any relief, I was in a tough spot. I knew that Alcoholics Anonymous was here, and that was the closest thing to a friendly direction that I could see. And but I knew that they expected me to do some work and work on myself, which was kind of counterintuitive to anything that I've ever done. I was interested more in judging everybody else and seeing where I fit with everybody else. I didn't want to take a good hard look at myself and the reason that I had made such a mess. I also knew that they expected that I knew from reading the book that what it said was that I had a spiritual malady, and what I needed was a spiritual solution. And it looked like, my problems are over here, like wife and money, and their solutions over here. That's a spiritual solution. And my thought was, it doesn't look like, to me, with my alcoholic mind, that if they're telling me that what I need to do is find this spiritual solution, and the spiritual solution that they're suggesting is that I maintain and enlarge a spiritual life, which comes through working the steps. And I had to be willing to do that, and it took a lot of pain, and it took several tries. And when I finally came here and was willing to take that first step and admit to myself, to my innermost self, that I was alcoholic, and I did need to be here if I wanted any chance to live and to have maybe a productive life. And so that first step was a stumbling block for me, but it was something that also, gave me some freedom. It was something that I ended up taking for the next, I took it daily for the next several years, even into sobriety and after having a spiritual awakening and beginning this journey. But I always kind of started my day out with that, just because I wanted to bring that to the forefront of my mind, so that I had a chance. So that's about what I got on the alcoholic and cannot manage my life. So these guys will be a little bit more into the solution, hopefully. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin.
Probably not. So once again, I'm Macon, and I'm an alcoholic. And I got the probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And, I got to tell you, I struggled with that word probably. And I had a good 25, 30-year drinking career. I tried to stop myself, self-will. Probably the last 15 years, I started to realize that maybe I was drinking more than I should. But I didn't have some of those traditional problems that a lot of people in the rooms end up with. I was still able to meet my financial obligations to my family. I was faking the spiritual part of my life. But what happens is alcoholism eventually erodes all that stuff, as we all know and found out. So I ran across a couple of things that I want to read, which I think probably does a much better job of explaining this no human power than I can sit up here and babble for about 30 minutes. But I thought this was good. With reading the above-mentioned statement that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism, we may not entirely grasp the gravity of its suggestion. Many times we may put a counselor or a therapist to whom we feel the most connected on a pedestal. Perhaps after leaving rehab, we begin to refocus our attention from the counselor or therapist to our sponsor, assuming we are working with one. If not our sponsor, maybe we put the onus of our belief of that power greater than ourselves on another person, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, public figure, etc. This is a tremendous problem and can further the concept of having a lack of power. As we attempt to rely on others, we find that invariably the human condition, which includes the inevitable mistakes and whatnot, is not a stable and reliable source for us. We find this direction, if we attempt it, isn't the best within where to attach our faith. It may be a struggle to come to the notion that we cannot rely upon others as an insurance policy against our drinking and our using. With everything we hear about working with others, being available, being of service, it can be, especially in early sobriety, confusing as to where we place our firm assurances. When we rely on others for our sobriety, we are setting ourselves up and the other person for failure and for the possibility of him or her building a large resentment towards us, or conversely, a resentment from us toward the person with whom we want to believe will save us or keep us sober. When that other person doesn't act, behave, give, respond in the way we need, this can be used as our impetus to drink before we have a spiritual foundation on which to stand. This can, given resentments are our number one offender, propel us towards taking a drink and therefore quite possibly drive us straight through the gateway of misery into the waiting arms of death. In order for us to follow the well-worn path to success in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, using the design for living provided for us in the Big Book, it is strongly suggested we find a power greater than ourselves, and that power may very well need to come in the form of a burgeoning concept of our higher power. This is to be a power greater than ourselves, and that does not mean another living being or an inanimate object. As people can let us down and material items can get lost and or break, we are not saviors for others, as they cannot be for us, just as we cannot of our own will save ourselves. Our defense must come from a higher power. Like it says in How It Works, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism, so we cannot think our way out of alcoholism. A sick mind cannot heal a sick mind. Self-will cannot overcome self-will, and if thinking is the big part of the problem, we cannot use the problem to solve the problem. So that's a fancy way, a much better way than I could, of saying that you can't rely on yourself. I couldn't. I probably spent the better part of 15 years promising that I would stop drinking. Never got more than a day out of it before, I couldn't do it. It took me personally to be in a hospital close to death before I finally realized that I needed some help, and I needed it to be something that I could believe in. I'd quit believing in myself. I'd quit believing in my brothers. I'd quit believing in all the promises I made. And I finally decided that if I was going to survive, I needed to turn that decision, that will, over to a higher power. I was born and raised in a Methodist church, and so the concept of God was not foreign to me. And it took me a long time to realize that the only way I was going to stop drinking was to turn it over to something that I could believe in. I quit believing in everything else. And so I know all of us go through those stages of trying to control it ourselves. But for me, and I think for most of us, it's got to come from some other power. I think that, for me, that has given me some comfort. I'm not saying that I'm not scared of the next drink, but I feel like I've got a program now. Every morning when I get up, I talk to my higher power, and I beg him, I pray to him to keep me away from alcohol and from drugs. And so coming up on 7 years, that's worked for me. It's the only thing that's ever worked for me. So that's what I've got to say about human power. Steve?
Surely you got more to say about it than that. God, Steve Moore, alcoholic. Good to be here. Glad all y'all are here. And I was teasing about the 40 minutes. Good news is I've only got 5 minutes because we're going to have 25 minutes for questions and answers. Isn't that what he said?
Yep.
All right. That's true. I might take 20 minutes to say 5 minutes worth of stuff, but we'll see. So good job, guys. I don't know how well, by the way, thanks, Wallace. We were in a programs committee meeting, and we were looking for something to do this panel on, and Wallace said, how about the ABCs? I know you said that as a joke, I hope, but anyway, it took, and I know, that was a joke, Wallace. But apparently Tim and Joe took it for the truth. But I'd never heard it discussed, and I really thought Wallace should be the one up here talking about it. Since he suggested it, I figured he'd get thrown under the bus. But anyway, glad to be here, and I'll do the best I can. And you know, when I think about the three pertinent ideas, and I always find it interesting, and I've never asked my sponsor, really never asked anybody else about that we were alcoholic. Were means that we were alcoholic. I mean, ain't I still alcoholic? So I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't read too much in that, but all I know is that I was a bad alcoholic. I was in a lot of trouble, and I couldn't quit drinking, and my life was definitely unmanageable. The other one says probably no human power. So does that mean maybe a human power could do it? I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into that too. But I know for me, you know, when I got to what I hope was into my drinking career, I knew I couldn't quit drinking on my own. I understood that. And so, having said that, I'll just kind of, I don't think you can really talk about seeking a power without really talking a little bit about powerless. And what happened in my life, you know, I started drinking wine or got drunk the first time at 12 years old. I was drinking MD 2020. And you start out there, your career is probably not going to go very much further than down. I didn't become a daily wino, but I fell in love with wine. I fell in love with not necessarily wine. MD 2020 ain't the top shelf stuff. The only reason we drank that is because it was the easiest thing to steal from the convenience store, I believe. If I'd have known that was going to be my first drunk that I'd have to tell in my AA talk at that time, I'd have chose something a little more sophisticated like Boone's Farm or TJ Swan stepping out, you know, something important. But anyhow, that's all we had, and it worked, and I loved the way it made me feel. Now, I'm a guy that started, I got introduced to smoking weed at 11 years old. I love that. I love that as much, if not more, than drinking alcohol and getting drunk. So the stage was set for a guy like me that I don't know that I had a lot of character defects, but all I know is I was a guy that was insecure, felt less than, and on the inside I didn't feel like I measured up. On the outside, I'm a guy that I'm a good poser. I'm a faker. Sometimes what you see ain't what you get, and I was able to live my life like that. And so what happened? You know, I just when I start drinking and partying and getting involved in all that stuff, that fear that I've got going on, the insecurity, the less than, all that stuff goes away, and it is a solution, like these guys said, like the book says. You know, drinking for me worked, and it worked well for a long time. Now, my drinking career, I was just thinking, making yours lasted how, 40 years?
At least.
You ought to get some kind of award for drinking for 40 years and hanging on and not dying. Of course, you almost died, but anyway, I'm glad you hung in there. So I was thinking about my drinking career, and it lasted, you said a good 40 years. I was thinking mine lasted a good 8 years, but actually it was a good 6 years, because by the time I turned 18, the last 2 years weren't good drinking years. Those were a couple of years that, you know, I was able to get a couple of DUIs. I was able to go to jail. You know, I was able to get a felony charge of selling weed. And when the book talks about a life being unmanageable, I know what that feels like. But here's the thing. That didn't make me alcoholic, and I thought it did. What it did is made me a guy that went to treatment, because that seemed like a good idea, because I figured going to treatment would look good on my resume when I got to court. And so I went to treatment and no intentions of drinking or no intentions of quitting drinking. No, I don't even think I had a desire to quit drinking, but I'll tell you what my life looked like at 20 years old is that I was still full of fear. The drinking and all the other stuff that I was doing quit working. You know, I was a guy by this time, I was full of a lot of guilt and shame and remorse by the way I had treated my parents, by the way I treated girlfriends, really by the way I treated anybody in my life. If they crossed my path, they'd be sorry they met me in most cases, probably all cases. And I was a guy that was just driven by extreme selfishness and dishonesty, and I didn't really care. It wasn't that I didn't have a conscience, but I didn't care who got hurt or how. And so I ended up getting introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous through a treatment center. And that's where I learned I was suffering from alcoholism. And, I'm a guy that was raised, my family, we were raised in a Presbyterian church, and that was a good church and good people in that church. But I was a guy that was disconnected from anything spiritual. And so once we turned 18 in my house, you didn't have to go back to church anymore, and that was fine with me. I didn't want to. But what happened was, it's funny sometimes what we run from, we run to. And I was running from God, running from spirituality. And, when I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous, they said, what I'm suffering from is a spiritual illness. Now, that was just the craziest thing I'd ever heard. Now, what I'm suffering from is lack of money, lack of girlfriend, because she had money, but she decided to go spend it somewhere else, unfortunately. Lack of driver's license was a dilemma. And the reason I had lack of money, because I wouldn't work. I didn't have a job. And so, when they talked about a spiritual illness, man, that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. But what they told me was that, that alcoholism is an illness, and that if I'm alcoholic, what I've got is a body that can't take drink, and I take that first drink, I create that phenomenon of craving. And I've got a mind that can't keep from taking the first drink. And so I'm in a serious dilemma. And what happens is they tell me that I'm going to need to pray, and I'm going to need to try to ask some kind of power for help. And they were, the book speaks specifically about God, and I didn't want to do any of that stuff. And what I realized was that, I might be in trouble, but if my solution is a spiritual solution, there's no way that it's going to work for me. There's no way that Alcoholics Anonymous would work in my life. And I thought, if there is a God, God isn't going to pay attention to a guy like me. Not the way that I had lived, not the way that I had treated people. And I didn't realize until it was explained to me that power, God is a name that we put on that power. And if you're here tonight and you don't believe in God, that's okay. We usually come here in three kinds of conditions. We're either atheist, agnostic, or a believer. And when it comes to Alcoholics Anonymous, it seems like it doesn't matter. I wasn't an atheist, because an atheist denies the existence of God. I think I was more agnostic. I didn't have any knowledge of God, nor did I want any. I didn't think. And the true believer is one that really practices some spiritual principles and have a life that works. And I think those were the kind of people that went to church, that had good lives, that had families and jobs and all that stuff that I judged and criticized and put down. Those were the true believers. They had a good life. Our book speaks of that. And it says I need to be open. I should be open to those terms and those spiritual terms that that people talk about. But I came in, I didn't want to have anything, I just didn't want to have anything to do with God. But what I did was, even though I was beat down, selfish, dishonest, full of fear, I was a guy that was full of ego, cocky, grandiose, arrogant. And I'm a guy, I don't have anything. I'm living with my parents at this time, and I don't have anything. I mean, I'm at ground zero, but I still act like I'm a big deal, And I'm suffering from alcoholism and don't really have a solution. And what I found was that, just like the book says, it doesn't matter how much belief I have or how little belief I have. It didn't really matter. What matters is, am I willing to believe that there's some kind of power? Am I willing to trust some people in Alcoholics Anonymous that have walked that path and that have tapped into a power that changed their life? Because I saw guys sober 1, 2, and 3 years. Now those were long time sobriety for me at that time. And I'll never forget, when I was in that place, Tom Ivister came and told his story. And he was a guy sober 27 years. And I thought, that's crazy. Nobody stays sober 27 years. And then I look at Wallace and I think, he's a guy that's been sober 55 years. And, I was able to see people that had made Alcoholics Anonymous a way of life and had tapped into a power that I had no doubt to believe those guys were powerless and out of control. So when I was faced with the fact that I was faced with two alternatives, like the book says. One was to continue drinking and blot out my life as best I could. And the only other alternative, if I'm alcoholic, is to accept spiritual help. Now, I don't have to accept that help in Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't have a monopoly on alcoholism. Churches do a great job with that. There's probably other organizations that can help people with a spiritual illness. But what we find is if we're alcoholic, Alcoholics Anonymous works best for most probably. So when I got to thinking about this, see, that God could and would if he were sought. So I can't manage my own life. Probably no human power can help me, but God can. There's a power that can help me. I had to Google salt. You think you know what words mean. I don't know. I flunked out of English, I think. I didn't know what salt means. And I Googled that and it says to seek. Well, that's a lot of help. So then I got to Google seek. And it really is just to try to look for something, or try to ask for help, ask for direction. And that's what I did. And I kept it that simple. And what I do today to try to connect with some power is when I wake up in the morning, I try to be conscious that I'm alive. And I try to ask God to direct my thinking. And I try to do this before I ever roll out of bed. Because pretty much when I roll out of bed, I'm busy and it's all over. And I ask God to direct my thinking and especially help my thinking be divorced from self-pity, self-centeredness, or selfishness and dishonest motives. Because my motives can really get tangled up. Length of sobriety has nothing to do with that. I've got to stay spiritually engaged or I'm in trouble. And I may or may not drink, but my selfishness and dishonesty can take over. And I get in almost as bad a trouble, if not worse, than I was when I was drinking. So I'm going to, when I was thinking about this particular piece of the ABCs, one of the things Bill wrote was, if I'm alcoholic, I need to seek a spiritual solution. And he used the word salt, and I won't quote it just right probably, but you'll get the idea. I need to cling on to it as if a drowning person would cling on to some kind of life raft. And that's the way I think about that. When I was drowning in my alcoholism, some folks in Alcoholics Anonymous sent me that life raft, and I really did, just like the book said, I felt like that was a flimsy reed. I mean, if my solution is God, man, I am in deep, deep trouble. But the life raft they sent me and the solution was steps 1 through 9. That's how I was able to seek that power. And now what I'm able to do is stay connected to that power through 10, 11, and 12. And so the other thing I do in the morning is I try to be quiet. And sometimes it's a few minutes. If it's much more than 5 minutes, I fell asleep. I can tell you that. If I meditate more than 5 minutes, I'm unconscious. But I try to be quiet and get centered and invite that power into my life. Because I still don't have any power. My life can still be a mess. Employees can aggravate me. Customers can aggravate me. My marriage can aggravate me. And if I don't stay connected to the power, I don't stand a chance. So one of the things I thought probably does a better job explaining it than I can is the chapter We Agnostics. What Bill wrote was, he says, when therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. So God's a name we put on the power. That power, I mean, I can choose it to be, I can put whatever name, spirit of the universe, creative intelligence, whatever makes sense to me. If we're not good with calling it God, maybe call it something else. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which we read in this book. Here's something was key for me to remember. It said, don't let any prejudice. When the book speaks of prejudice, it ain't prejudice like we really like to think of prejudice. What that is old ideas. Whatever old ideas I got about God, Christianity, religion, spiritual powers, whatever I had wasn't working because I wasn't able to stay sober. So I need to set aside any of those old ideas that I have against spiritual terms. It says I need to not let any of those prejudices deter me from honestly asking myself what they mean to me. It says at the start this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to affect my first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. It says afterwards we found ourselves accepting many things that seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. And I love this. It says our own conception, however limited, was good enough. So it doesn't matter how inadequate I thought it was. And I always like what Tom Ivester used to say is what I need to do is just be willing to grow where I'm planted. You know, wherever we're at today spiritually, wherever I'm at today spiritually, or the lack of spirituality doesn't seem to matter. Am I willing to grow? Am I willing to change? And so, you know, when I think about when we read how it works, I try to stay mentally engaged when we read how it works, because that is really the meat of Alcoholics Anonymous. When Bill and our founders wrote that, it was where it all. To me, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so I try to listen to that, and I love what it says. And I'm as guilty as probably anybody. Well, y'all probably not guilty of this. I am. I check out when people read how it works. Our group agreed not to read how it works for a while, and then it got voted back in to read how it works. I think we were scared if we didn't read how it works, newcomers might not ever hear how it works. Because unfortunately, well, I won't say that, but anyway, it says what in order I can't go through with it, and it says do not be discouraged. We need to encourage people where they're at. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. Here's the thing, we are not saints. Now, I want to come up here and act like I'm a saint. I want to walk around and act like I'm a big deal. But the truth is, I'm far from it. Most of you know that. I didn't have to throw that out there. Those of you keep coming back, you'll learn it pretty quick. But here's the point. Am I willing to grow along spiritual lines? Every day. Not just getting sober and trying to get a year or trying to get 5 years or whatever. It says the principles we set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. So when I think about that third, or the third pertinent idea that God could and would if He were sought, I'm able to seek that power through taking those steps. I'm able to seek that power through working and being current with a sponsor. I'm able to help guys seek that power by being willing to sit down and read the book with a new guy. Being sit down, and when it says pray, we pray. And when we get to that third step, we get on our knees. Unless the guy just don't want to do it, because it is kind of weird, but we do it anyway, and we pray that third step prayer, and we try to surrender and invite that power in. That's going to, because I think there's always a certain amount of inadequacy working with a new guy. But what I know is when I'm working with a new guy, he's dying of alcoholism if he's alcoholic. If my heart's in the right place, there's nothing I'm going to do to hurt him. And I like to just tie that in, and I'll wrap it up with this and get Macon back up here for the questions. But I like to tie it in with the second tradition, that there is an ultimate authority, and it's not me. Y'all remind me of that quite often. I appreciate it. But the ultimate authority is God. It is the power in the group. whether I want to call it God or not doesn't really seem to matter. My job is to be a trusted servant. I need to quit trying to control things, quit trying to govern things, and just try to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous and serve my group and serve other people and do the best I can to help people and not hurt them and being judgmental and critical and gossip. I'm just speaking from experience because I do all that stuff. And I consciously try to catch myself when I'm doing it. And I try hard, and I know some of you don't believe this, but if I don't have anything good to say about somebody, I really do try to keep my mouth shut. It don't happen much. It does every now and then. I try, but I try hard because what I'm trying to do is make some spiritual progress. But I don't ever want to use that term spiritual progress to condone bad behavior that I know I don't need to be engaged in. But here's the thing. If I don't have any power in my life, I'm going to do stuff that's going to hurt people. There's no question about it. That's my experience. And today I think it's been a good day. I don't think I've hurt anybody. It's still a little bit early. It's not quite bedtime, so be careful. But I appreciate Macon asking me to do this, and hopefully I've said something to make sense. But thank you, Wallace. I think it's a good idea because it really is what it all boils down to. That if I'm alcoholic, my life's going to continue to get out of control if I keep drinking. I don't care how good my sponsor or home group is. That stuff's important. It ain't going to keep me sober. If I'm not connected to a power outside of myself, I'm probably not going to make it. So, thanks, guys.
So thank you, Steve, and thank you, Kevin. It strikes me that these three ABCs are something that we all, at some point in our journey to sobriety, we all embrace those, or at least we all finally accept them. I mean, we all have a different way of getting there, but something that we all have in common. So with that, we'd like to open up the floor for any questions.
Better ask some, or he'll get Kevin and I back up there to talk some more.
Yeah.
You don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah, real quick. So thank you guys. Y'all did a really good job of explaining those, and making it like what you were talking about being the pertinent ideas. We probably should have a good understanding of these three ideas before we move further on in the book. And this is right before we get into the third step, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's too terribly important that I understand exactly what's happening. I need a good idea. I just know I was like Kevin. I didn't know what was going on. I was just kind of doing what my sponsor told me to do. But one thing that I do remember just having a little bit of confusion about, that A where it says, that we were alcoholic and we could not manage our own lives. That always just arose a bit of confusion with me, why those are two separate things. What's the difference between being alcoholic and not being able to manage my own life? You know what I mean? I've got a good idea about that today of why it separates those two things, but I've seen a couple of new faces and stuff like that, and I just wanted all three of y'all's experience on why, my life is unmanageable on top of me being alcoholic.
I'll go first. For me, it's the fact that once I stopped drinking, I kind of got worse. My life became more unmanageable when I wasn't drinking because I didn't have any relief or anything to fall back on, and I was afraid of depression and misery and then my mind, started coming up with this, I know now that it was a delusion, but it kept telling me that, to drink was a good idea, when in fact, I had all the results previously were telling me that it wasn't. And eventually, without any help from Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd succumb to that voice in my head and I'd drink again. And so I was, my life was unmanageable either way, drinking or not. So that's probably why it's two parts. Maybe it was just for me. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know, Steve.
So, good question. Maybe talk to your sponsor. So, alcoholic and unmanageability, I think being alcoholic, I might could hold my life together drinking, or maybe some people might can hold their life together drinking alcoholically. I know I couldn't. I couldn't even have a good life with drinking. To me, I think they go hand in hand. I think that's probably why he put them together. I think that's why they're together in step one. That if I'm powerless over alcohol, then that makes me alcoholic. You know, and he just is reiterating the fact that if I keep drinking, the book says gradually things get worse. That might be an understatement. If I'm alcoholic and I keep drinking, my life is definitely going to get worse. There's no question about it. And it's going to be unmanageable. So I think it's impossible to separate them. I think they go hand in hand.
And I think I would be a case study for that, because I was able to drink alcoholically and be successful and fool everybody right up to the point where I couldn't. And then everything became unmanageable, you know. And so it is, I understand the two, but the part about being unmanageable, it can swoop in. I mean, I was doing so good, and all of a sudden, once it went backwards, it started going backwards so fast I couldn't get off. You know, and at that point, you're just kind of watching yourself. It's like, really? Is this really happening to me? You know, but the bus won't stop. You know, you're just stuck going in the wrong direction. So I see the two. You know, you can certainly, and there's a lot of us, I think, that can be very functional as an alcoholic, but eventually it catches up with you. It just does. But thanks, good question.
My name's Kelly. I'm alcoholic.
Hey, Kelly.
And just to tag on to that, it's such a good question, Ryan. I love it. And you guys did a great job. But, you know, what I was thinking about is, you know, being alcoholic, you know, being powerless over alcohol, you know, for some people, thank you, Macon, for sharing that. They are separate, you know. I've sponsored many women and seen that. My story was like yours, Steve. I mean, honey, they just didn't mix any. Like, my life was unmanageable. But I'll tell you this, without that unmanageability in my life, I would not have submitted myself to these steps. Like, being alcoholic, I mean, you know, that's one thing. But without the broken relationships and the homelessness and the jail trips and the, like, you know, waking up dead, pretty much. I mean, without all that, I would not have submitted myself to any of these other steps. I mean, what's the point? What's the point, right? And so for me, when a sponsor kind of broke that down, it's like, we need that unmanageability.
Yeah.
We really did. It beat me up. I needed it in my life. Thank goodness for it. What a great motivator. Thanks.
Well, and you're right, Kelly, and that's one of those things you hear people, it takes you a while to understand it, but when they say it's a gift,
Yes.
It really is. Mm-hmm. You know, the alcoholism and your life finally becoming so unmanageable that you're forced, if you want to survive, to do something. And the good news is that the big book has there's the solution. All you have to do is follow the directions. But you got to get there mentally to be able to do that, and it's a hard thing for some of us to do. Anybody else? Matthew.
My name is Matthew. I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Matthew.
You did a good job. I appreciate listening to this. You know, and Steve talked about this, and I kind of wanted to ask it again because I think it's something that I struggled with, and I think guys that I've sponsored have struggled with it. I think a lot of people struggle with it. You know, the question always is, and I've actually had it. I just had it asked not long ago by someone I work with. They got a loved one that's struggling with alcohol. And they're pretty confident that the family member is an alcoholic, but the alcoholic himself is not too confident about that decision. You know, and I've worked with guys that really struggle with the God concept. You know, this idea of a higher power, and this idea, because they've got a lot of animosity, got a lot of prejudice back towards it. And I know, looking back at my own life, sitting in detox, 7 years ago, you know, there wasn't a lot of options for me. I was kind of at the end of my rope. You know, you go through plans A through Z, and you're like, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a lot of options other than just praying. You know, and I wasn't smart enough to figure that out. Somebody had to tell me to do it, and just ask for help. But you know, how do you think the best way to try to help somebody come to realize that they can't do this thing anymore? Like, I've had people that I've seen in detox, I've had guys that I work with that clearly their lives are unmanageable, and they know that they're struggling. They know, and I can tell in their hearts and in their eyes that they want to stop, but they just don't seem to be able to, and they just get on this cycle of repeat after repeat after repeat after relapse after relapse. You know, through treatment center, I'm thinking of a few guys that I've sponsored in my time here that they just keep on that same pattern over and over, and they know they want to stop, but they just can't. I mean, do y'all have any experience with maybe how to help a guy realize it? How do you, or is there a way to help a guy realize it?
Matthew, and I say it all the time, I think that we all have a clock in our head, a sober clock, and that when it goes off, then people are ready to hear it. I mean, we're taught to share our experience, strength, and hope, because usually if we're in there trying to help them, we've survived, then we finally turn that page. But I'm like you. I mean, I've got some, and when I walk out of the detox, sometimes I think, well, we've made a difference. And, a week later, I'm amazed. And it just shows you how devious and how powerful the disease and alcohol is, and everything else for that matter. But, I think that we probably all have our own style of trying to reach somebody. But if they don't want to be reached, I don't care how good you are. It's just a matter of that bottom that everybody always talks about.
Yeah, that's kind of in my experience that they have to surrender, and sometimes the bottle forces them to surrender. I can't really force them that much. I can try to guide them as well as I can, but sometimes it takes circumstances, and sometimes it takes the alcohol.
So I think what my experience has been for myself in working with guys is if a guy fully engaged in Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's probably a lot to that that we can cover in the next few minutes, but at a bare minimum take steps 1 through 9. In the book, what it says is some huge promises on page 86 or somewhere. It's between 84 and 88. You'll find it. What it says is a huge promise for an alcoholic like me. What it says is I get put in a position of neutrality. I'm safe. I'm protected. Here's the kicker. It almost scares me to think about it. It makes me thirsty. It says it's almost as the problem's been removed. It doesn't exist. That's what the book says. But it's got a pretty build. He always throws a hard caveat or whatever you call it. He said, that's how I'm going to react as long as I keep in fit spiritual condition. So if I drink again, there's something wrong with my spiritual condition. If I keep hurting people, if I keep mistreating people, my employees, my wife, home group members, there's something wrong with my spiritual condition. It's lacking. I can still be spiritually bankrupt and sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm speaking that from experience.
Wallace.
I am Wallace. I'm an alcoholic. It's not my job to convince a man or woman that they are alcoholic. If John Barleycorn can't do it, I can't do it. But the book tells me that John Barleycorn is our best advocate. It tells me that if a guy is not ready for the program, wondering whether he's alcoholic or not, suggest to him that he go to the next bar and start drinking and see what booze does to him. I heard a lady at the International Convention talking. Her name was Gloria. She was in and out of AA for about 6 months. And she'd come back, and every time she'd tell her sponsor, look at me. I'm a professor over at the university. I've got a beautiful home. I've got a new Cadillac automobile. I'm getting along just fine, but maybe I do drink a little bit. The sponsor eventually told her, she says, you have thoroughly convinced me that you are not an alcoholic. What I know about you is just a drunken bitch. She went out and got sober then just to prove to her. We walk like a duck and quack like a duck. In all probability, we're a duck. And if we are having all those problems in our life that we see other alcoholics have, they're in our life, it's telling us something. The identification process is taking place. And unless that happens in an alcoholic, they're not going to come into the program.
Thank you, Wallace.
We got time real quick?
Yeah.
All right, so I was with my sponsor. We were reading on Sunday. The next to last 2 pages, Till Wives. And Steve kind of said something about it a little earlier, and I don't know if you were alluding to this or not, but it says, do not be discouraged. And we ought not to discourage anybody. We ought to be trying to like encourage people as best we possibly can. And I know I've been victim to it. I've done this. I've used these kind of tactics of like scaring dudes, and like, you got to get this, and like, if you don't do this, you're gonna get all like that. And like, I'm dealing with a family member right now, and my family likes to throw the guilt trip at him. They like to try and shame him. They like to try and use all these things that we think are gonna work, that we know with our experience is not gonna work. Like nothing, no frothy emotional appeal is gonna get us sober. But the best thing I could possibly do for a man who's struggling, who wants to get sober, doesn't really know how, or is having a hard time with that, is encourage him and let him know that he can. Because who am I to doubt the power of this program that we found here, that somebody like me who came in here and didn't want to believe in a power greater than myself and was able to be brought to that place by just working through these steps, And it was, nobody had to scare me. Nobody had to guilt trip me. Nobody had to do any of that stuff. People encouraged me and told me I could do this, that it was possible. And I think that kind and loving encouragement is what's going to work best for the new guy who's having a hard time. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. That's it, yeah.
All right.
Brian, turn it back over to you.
Y'all just going to stand up where you are and say the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.